My name is Amy King. I teach fifth grade at Bryan Elementary School, and I'm here to present my score report. The first thing I'd like to do is take a look at my classroom demographics. I have 24 students, 12 boys and 12 girls. Of those 24 students, 45.85% are in general education, 12.51% are English language learners, 20.82% take part in exceptional education, and 20.82% are gifted. The test that I chose to look at is a fifth grade fraction operations test. I gave that test in January, which was the beginning of the second semester. We had just come back from Christmas vacation, and we were not able to come back in person. We came back remotely. And so this was it was an assessment of their retention of fraction operations, which I had taught prior to getting out for Christmas. So about 3.5 weeks prior. Let's take a look at the test items. There were 15 questions that you can see listed here. And what I did was I categorized them by the content of the question, and I showed what percentage of students were able to get the question correct. For example, number 1 was about simplifying fractions, and 82.6% of my students were able to get that question correct. So let's take a look at areas of celebration. Most of my students were able to solve simple word problems. Number 3 and number 7 are examples. Number 3 was an addition word problem, addition of fractions, and number 7 was a subtraction of fractions word problem. And 82.6% and 73.9% of students were able to get those questions correct. And all of the addition and subtraction of fractions problems were with unlike denominators. Also, most students were able to simplify fractions. Number 1 and number 2 were examples of that. 82.6% and 78.6% of students were able to get those questions right when it came to simplifying. And then most students were able to add and subtract fractions accurately. Number 12 and number 15 were examples of those types of questions, and 82.6% and 69.6% of students were able to get those questions correct. Now let's take a look at areas of weakness. The average score on this test was 72%. And for me, I usually consider that to be pretty low. Normally, on a normal assessment, when I have my students in my classroom, the average score is usually somewhere between 80 and 89. So 72% felt a little low to me. I also thought that it was definitely a weakness that only 56.5% of students were able to do the multi-step problem. There were several word problems on the test, but only one of them was a multi-step word problem. And I know that that's a struggle, so that wasn't a shock to me, but I would have hoped that more than 56.5% of my students would have been able to get that question correct. I also consider it a weakness that 4 of my students failed the assessment. I realize that if you're looking at a bell curve, someone generally is going to fail every assessment. But usually for my classroom assessments, if I feel that I have felt that I have taught the unit the way that I wanted to, and I've been able to do enough formative assessment along the way, usually none of my students fail the assessment at the end. It is a disappointment to me if that does happen. I feel like in this situation, I had a little less control than normal because the students were remote at the time. And we'll talk more about that in just a minute. So, like I just referred to on the previous slide, we did have a few issues. Prior to Christmas, there was an uptick in COVID cases. And so we had to unexpectedly go remote before Christmas. Then the students and I had 2 weeks off for Christmas, and then we had to come back remote for a week as well. So that really gave us about 4 weeks of time where we did not have any in-person instruction. And so I do think that that affected my test results. Like I said before, the assessment results were a little bit lower than what I'm used to just on a typical school week where we've been able to be in class in person and have in-person instruction. So what were the implications from those results? Like I just said, in-person learning is needed, especially with elementary students. I think we've all had those experiences this year, where we've seen just how important in-person learning is, especially to struggling students, especially to students from struggling families. Some parents were great about having their students get on for the lessons and complete the work, and some not so much. So I think it just reiterated how incredibly important it is for us to have our students in person in class. I also found that students did not retain as much as I would have liked. How quickly we forget. And I did a little research to see what I could find, and I found that roughly 56% of what we have learned is forgotten within about an hour of when we learned it. After a day, that number increases to 66%. So whatever we've learned after 24 hours has gone by, we've forgotten about 66% of it. And then after 6 days, we've forgotten about 75% of what we've learned. So it really made me think about retention and what I can do to promote retention. So first of all, I learned that I needed to have some additional practice with multi-step problems. Too many of the students were not able to answer that question correctly. So I would do that through modeling and reading and interpreting the questions in front of the students, letting them see what my thought processes are, was very, very helpful. Also, once I got my students back in class, I was able to do more effective formative assessment. Like I said, that's much easier to do when I have my students physically in front of me. And then back to the strategies that promote retention, I found through my research that giving mixed practice can often help students to retain what they've learned better, because it causes something different to happen in the brain when all of the types of questions that students are working on, when those questions are different from each other. Often when we give a test, and I'm guilty of this, they'll have several questions in a row that are very much the same, different numbers, same types of questions. So students just get in a routine, they kind of get on autopilot and work the questions out one after the other after the other. And the article that I read talked about how giving mixed types of practice helps with retention, because instead of getting on autopilot, the students are having to read and think each time about how to solve the problem. And so that promotes retention. Also, we can have students increase the connections that are being made in their brain by verbalizing how they solved a problem. And those are both just simple things that you can do that really don't take a lot of time, but can really increase the amount of retention that your students get. So having them do just a think, pair, share, having them turn and talk to each other, this is how I solved this problem, that also causes an increase of connection in their brains, and it helps with retention. And that concludes my score report presentation. Thank you so much for your time.